Wait, they what? The Soviets want radio airtime. Have they ever, one single time, ever asked for this before? No. Wow, it's pretty exciting, yeah? Hey, maybe it's something really good, you know? Huh? Yeah, I should lower my expectations. Yeah, probably so. Okay, well, thanks for telling me, though. All right, see ya. June 17th, 1951. We've seen an awful lot of him the past few months. Douglas MacArthur, his outspokenness, his popularity, his speech in Washington, the public loves him, or at least they have loved him, because now what we see is the public losing interest in Douglas MacArthur. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson spoke at length about China in the Senate. Several other players tried to tell the Chinese and North Koreans they were interested in negotiating a ceasefire to the war, and in the field, the UN forces were advancing slowly, and enemy resistance was pretty strong. On the 13th, U.S. First Corps Commander Frank Milburn sends combined armor and infantry patrols up both sides of the Iron Triangle from base points to see what's up at Pynoggang, not Pyongyang, Pynoggang, at its apex. These patrols meet no enemy resistance, and Pynoggang is in fact deserted. Instead of defending it, the Chinese are set up in good positions both northeast and northwest of it. And U.S. Ninth Corps, advancing northeast from Gimhwa at the eastern base of the triangle, finds heavy Chinese defenses to the north there. So the road complex within the Iron Triangle, which is what the fight here is really for, is an unusable no man's land at the moment. Further east, as the week nears its end, U.S. 1st Marine and ROK, South Korean 5th Division, finally reached their designated segments of the Kansas line. So with 1st and 9th Corps reaching the Wyoming line and 10th Corps reaching Kansas positions, the 8th Army had reached its allowed limit of general advance in support of efforts to open ceasefire negotiations. As yet, there had been no clear sign that Chinese and North Korean authorities favored that kind of resolution. But there had been a search for a way to open armistice talks, and with some result. What result is that? Well, I'll get there in a few minutes. First, some more Army stuff. UN Commander Matt Ridgway has asked 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet for his recommendations for the best location for 8th Army to be during any ceasefire. Van Fleet assumed that enemy forces would violate the terms of an armistice by improving their offensive capability and renewing operations without warning. On the basis of this assumption, he recommended Lyon, Kansas because of its suitability for a strong defense. I went over his reasons for not having a defense line further north last week, but besides those, he figures should there be a ceasefire, 8th Army is going to have to deal with the massive problem of military government and civilian relief in areas that have been completely stripped of food and vital supplies and services, and young men. However, since the actual ceasefire agreement may require a buffer zone between the opposing forces, which would require a withdrawal of several kilometers, they should be well north of Kansas line before any such deal is made, right? But you gotta make contingency plans. So Ridgway agrees about the Kansas line and says he'll try to tell Van Fleet in time before any negotiations so he can at least get some of his force like 25 or so kilometers above Kansas. But what if there never are negotiations? Or what if there are, but they're long, drawn-out ones that give the Chinese and North Koreans time to build up a massive offensive? What then? Because just staying all that time at Kansas could then be a really costly mistake. So Ridgway has had his guys looking at longer-range plans to go much deeper into North Korea and looking at the logistical problems with those plans. And what they favor most is a 3-phased attack up to a line from Pyongyang to Wonsan. Phase 1 would be an advance on Wonsan by 2 columns, one up the East Coast Road and one along the Seoul-Wonsan axis. Phase 2 would be an amphibious landing at Wonsan to help out, and Phase 3 would be 8th Army driving generally northwestward to take Pyongyang. Ridgway gives Van Fleet this outline and says, make it into a detailed battle plan before July 10th. Ridgway, as you may remember, reported a couple weeks ago to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the communist forces were not at present capable of assembling a force greater than that which the UN forces had recently twice beaten. Now on the 14th, Ridgway reports, enemy lines of communication are overextended and his supply situation is aggravated by heavy rainfall and air interdiction. The JCS are considering removing the restrictions on Ridgway's freedom to exploit such conditions. Okay. Last week, I mentioned that the UN nations that have forces in Korea chose to communicate the ideas of a ceasefire, the Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong and his foreign minister Zhou Enlai through neutral diplomats in Peking. This they have done by now, but have not received a response. There are, to the British anyhow, signs that the Chinese might be preparing for a truce of some sort. Reports in London from China say the Chinese media is reviving Mao's 1937 position that a true revolutionary leader must be adept at making himself and his followers advance and change their views according to changing circumstances. And that's all well and good, but there is still nothing concrete that indicates that this is in any way in the cards. I also talked briefly last week about the interactions between George Kennan and Yakov Malik. A few more words about that. Kennan is the top expert on Russia in the U.S. government. At the moment, he's on leave from state to write a book about U.S.-Soviet relations. So he's not an official diplomat just now. He's also someone the Soviets respect and trust. Kennan was to approach Soviet ambassador to the UN, Malik, with a message. This is the brainchild of Freeman Matthews, currently Deputy Undersecretary of State, but it's been approved by Atchison. The message roughly says the U.S. and USSR look like they're on a collision course over Korea, and no one wants that, right? And it seems the Chinese are pulling both of them in further. So wouldn't it be a good idea if there was a ceasefire and an armistice in Korea, maybe even on or near the current front lines? Kennan wrote to Malik and just asked for a meeting, and Malik phoned him back and had him out to his summer house on Long Island. In a sense, it was the day for which Kennan had trained since he became a diplomat in 1925. He spoke to the ambassador in fluent Russian. He approached the subject in roundabout fashion, knowing that Malik could make no commitment at an exploratory meeting on such a sensitive issue. Malik, of course, can't answer anything until he consults Moscow. And again, as I said last week, they talk again the 5th, and Malik says Moscow does want a peaceful solution, but the Soviets aren't directly involved, so any approaches should be to the Chinese or North Koreans. Why am I rehashing this? Even with the added details, like at the Long Island meeting, Malik dumped a tray of fruit and wine into his own lap by accident. Why? Because the U.S. State Department has concealed the approach to Malik from the Allied ambassadors. The reasons are twofold. They obviously don't want to give anyone false hopes. And two, any leaks at all to the public could quite likely sabotage the whole initiative. Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs Dean Rusk even tells the ambassadors the 5th not to believe any peace feeler stories they may happen to read in the press. We've seen over the past few weeks the Joint Chiefs and the Truman administration finally consolidating their actual aims in Korea. But should Truman make an actual statement about peace terms? And should it be just in the U.S. name or in the name of the 15 other nations fighting in Korea? The U.S. certainly does not want to bind itself to anything in advance either. So maybe ceasefire specifications should be really general. John Hickerson, another Assistant Secretary of State, believes that. But also, since the Chinese continue to fight, thinks there's no real hope for a ceasefire. But they themselves are pretty open to options. I mean, they have no statement drafted, no firm position staked out. They're willing to discuss whatever. They just have to get the enemy to stop fighting. For American purposes, the important point was that the Allied ambassadors had given Washington free rein to pursue an armistice. The ambassadors wanted to be told what was happening, but the mechanics would be entrusted to the State Department. But hey, here's the twist. The Soviets might actually respond. Yep. See, the UN sponsors a weekly public affairs radio program. They've had it since the UN was founded, and the Soviets have completely ignored it. But now, Malik wants airtime on the June 23rd program, 6 days from now. It could just be coincidence, Well, it could, but it seems more likely that he will have something to say about Korea. But it's interesting how things change. The US has come full circle from its position last October, from its position last June, which is now that of this June. And in June, with the CCF very close to real disaster in Korea, communist thinking altered too. The battle lines, except in the west, where they stood near the parallel, already stood well above the old line of demarcation, and the situation for the communist powers was worsening. It was very clear to Soviet observers that the CCF could not win a decision in South Korea. They could not even halt the slow, steady UN advance northwards. It was also clear that the continuing hot war in the Far East was hastening the slow rearmament of Europe under NATO. Continued communist intransigence could tend only to unite the Western allies in the long run. When communists cannot win by force, they are prepared to negotiate. If, in 1951, they could stop the UN advance by talking, they would firm an increasingly fluid and dangerous situation, and in effect achieve a tactical victory. We will see next week what Malik has to say. We've heard lately what a bunch of people have to say in the US Senate. Dean Acheson's testimony at the MacArthur Senate hearings lasted all of last week, and although there are further witnesses this week, and it looks like next week too, they don't seem to add anything substantial to the proceedings. There is this, though. On the last day of his Senate testimony, Secretary George Marshall had stated that the decision to relieve MacArthur was made with the awareness that it would be controversial. But Marshall added, it was also felt that after the height of the emotional wave passed, there would be due some sober thinking. Marshall's attitude irked Senator Bork Hickenlooper. That might be interpreted as an assumption by the administration that the American people would lull themselves into a situation of indifference after a period of time, he said. I think sober thinking and lull are not comparative terms, Marshall replied. But what's actually going on with Douglas MacArthur himself? Well, it turns out Marshall may be right. MacArthur has been traveling the country, making speeches and appearances. But the attention he receives is diminishing. More and more, people are going to see him out of curiosity and not to hear what he has to say. For example, when he's in Chicago, his daytime motorcade has 3 million spectators. But when he speaks that evening at Soldier Field, it's only half full. And his rhetoric becomes increasingly demagogic and less palatable to the general public. In the Texas legislature, he says the foreign policy created by civilians in government is influenced and even dictated from abroad. In Seattle, it's our political stature has been sadly impaired by a succession of diplomatic blunders and reckless spendthrift aims at home. There is a growing anxiety in the American home as disclosures reveal graft and corruption over a broad front in our public service. MacArthur also found himself adopted, once his government logistical support ended, by people from the far right of American politics. And gradually, the American people, tired of hearing MacArthur espouse political ideas that they had rejected in 1948 when they elected Harry S. Truman president. He's still the darling of Time and Life magazines, but he really is starting to, well, flop in live appearances, especially in a trip to Texas. Welcome MacArthur flags sell first for $1 a piece, but soon drop to 15 cents since no one's buying them. In San Antonio, the police anticipate 500,000 people, but only 80,000 turn up. In Houston, 20,000 people come to hear him at Rice Stadium, which seats 80,000. And Truman's crowd there in 1948 was way larger. The Cotton Bowl in Dallas is only a third full as well, and apparently many people leave before the event is finished. Well, with that, this week is finished, with ever more hopes that someone on the communist side will respond to the possibility of a ceasefire, and Ridgway and Van Fleet making plans for how and where to defend in future. And MacArthur, well, still popular, but really losing support in large amounts. But why is this? Why the fall from grace? This is a huge hero, an icon. To quote Golden again to end today, although MacArthur perhaps did not recognize it at the time, there was a core reason for his swift passage. The Republicans, who brought him to Washington and gave him a forum before the Congress and the Senate hearing, did so with a mixture of concern over war policy and a desire to torment the administration. MacArthur mistook the affectionate attention as an invitation to mount a political crusade and drive Truman from the White House. MacArthur, to the Republicans, had a place and a purpose. Once he had testified and castigated the administration and received the cheers of the nation, there was no further use for him. MacArthur basked in the limelight from mid-April through mid-June. Afterwards, he was a lonely old man in a Manhattan hotel suite, as far removed from any role in the Korean War as a raw recruit in a New Jersey Army training camp. What in the world is going to happen? I guess we will find out next week on the radio, and we'll be here for that, the same as every week right here, and on Time Ghost History, and on World War II, and we do it all thanks to the Time Ghost Army. Marcus Pruting is the Army Member of the Week, and you too can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.